Every month, millions of people type questions into Google that they'd never say out loud. Questions about whether what they're feeling is normal, whether what their partner said counts as a real thing, whether they should be worried about themselves or their kids or the world. And the internet does answer. Social media answers. AI answers. The answers aren't always wrong, but they're often incomplete. So that is why I decided to start Ask the Therapist, a new monthly series here on MetaTherapy, where I will take real questions, questions that are swirling around right now in the culture, in the headlines, in your comment section, and I answer them the way a clinician actually would or might. Not with a viral hot take, not with a buzzword, with a context, evidence, and a little bit of honesty about what we actually know and what we don't. Today, we're going to start with 6 questions. So here's what we'll be covering. Should I vent to ChatGPT about my anxiety? TikTok told me I have anxious attachment. Is that real? I can't find a therapist in network. What do I do? My teenager has been talking to an AI companion for months. Should I be worried? I have a climate anxiety. Is that even a thing? And then finally, my partner keeps saying I'm trauma bonding. Does that phrase mean anything? Real questions, current events. Let's get into it. Okay, so question 1 is it okay to vent to ChatGPT about my anxiety? An AXA IPSOS Mind Health report in February of 26 showed that 60+% of people are already using AI for mental health support, but the majority report dissatisfaction. A Mass General Brigham study of 20,000 adults found chatbot emotional use was linked to higher rates of depression and anxiety. I want to start with something I actually mean. I get it. Your therapist isn't available at 2 a.m. Calling a friend feels like a burden, and ChatGPT is right there. It doesn't judge you, it doesn't get tired of your spiral, it doesn't check its phone while you're talking. That accessibility is real, and for certain things, it's genuinely useful. So, what is ChatGPT good for? Well, things like journaling prompts, psychoeducation, such as what is a panic attack, or explain anxiety to me, preparing for a hard conversation, organizing your thoughts before a therapy session, researching what type of therapist you might need. These are legitimate uses where AI adds value. And here's where I want to be honest with you. A study published earlier this year, one of the largest of its kind, surveyed over 20,000 adults about their AI use and their mental health. And the finding was striking. People who used chatbots for emotional support and personal advice were more likely, not less likely, to report symptoms of anxiety and depression. Now, as I've said in many cases in the past when we talk about research, correlation is not causation. It's entirely possible that people who already are struggling are the ones who turn to AI. That's a real confound. But it's also possible that there's something about AI emotional support that isn't actually helping. And I think there is. So here's what I think is happening. ChatGPT reflects back at you. It validates. It agrees. It doesn't push back. It doesn't get uncomfortable. It doesn't challenge your interpretation of events. And in therapy, that's actually sometimes the most important moment. When someone says something that, and I say this gently, I hear you and I want to offer a different way of looking at that. That friction is therapeutic. AI by design removes that friction. There's also this rumination trap, the loop of replaying thoughts without resolution. Venting to an AI that simply reflects agreement can reinforce that loop rather than interrupt it. The clinical goal isn't to feel heard and then feel the same thing again louder. It's to move. So here's my actual answer to the question. Use AI for information. Use it for structure. Use it to prepare. Do not use it as your primary source of emotional support. For grief, for trauma, for crises, for anything where you're genuine distress that requires a human. Not because AI is evil, but because the therapeutic relationship is not incidental to the healing process. It is the mechanism of healing. And I'll say it again because I mean it. The relationship is not where healing happens, it is how healing happens. So, question number 2: TikTok taught me I have anxious attachment. Is that real? I actually love that people are curious about attachment theory. I mean that. Attachment theory is one of the most robust, well researched frameworks in all of psychology. It is not a trend. It is going back to John Bowlby in the 1960s, extended by Mary Ainsworth. And there's now decades of research showing how our early relational experiences shape how we connect with people as adults. So when TikTok says your attachment style might be why your relationship feels this way, that core idea is sound. So what are these attachment styles? Well, the first is secure. This is someone who's comfortable with intimacy and autonomy. The second is anxious. This is a craving for closeness, fear of abandonment, high sensitivity to relational signals. And then there's avoidant, which is self-reliant, uncomfortable with too much closeness, tends to back under stress. And then the final one is disorganized. This is a mix of both anxious and avoidant, often shows up in people with early trauma. These are not fixed identities. They're patterns that can and do shift with therapy and with healthy relationships. But here's where I think people get misled. A 45-second TikTok is not a clinical assessment. A quiz on Instagram is not a clinical assessment. And the difference matters because in a real clinical context, attachment isn't a label you get. It's a map we use together to understand patterns. And maps look different close than they do from 30,000 feet. The risk isn't that people learn about attachment. The risk is when the label becomes an explanation that replaces change. I'm anxiously attached can become an identity instead of a starting point. It can become a reason relationships don't work instead of a map toward making them work better. A diagnosis, a framework, a style. These are tools, they're not verdicts. If you learn something about yourself from TikTok and it resonated, bring it to a therapist. That's actually a great place to start a conversation. Just hold it loosely until it's been looked at more carefully. Okay, so question number 3. I need therapy, but can't find anyone in network. What can I actually do? APA 2026 Trends reported that policy shifts are actively impacting psychologists' ability to deliver care. Provider shortages, equity gaps, and insurance barriers are the defining access challenge of this moment in American mental health care. So let me say something that I don't hear said often enough by people in my field. The mental health system in this country is genuinely broken, not in a hyperbolic way, in a documented, measurable, people are suffering because of it way. The therapist shortage is real. Insurance reimbursement rates are so low that many experienced clinicians simply can't afford to stay in network. Wait lists are months long, and if you're in rural areas, the options can be close to non existent. And none of that is your fault. And I don't want you to spend energy blaming yourself for not being able to find something that has a structural reason for being hard to find. Here's where I'd actually point you in order of what I'd try first. The first is Open Path Collective. This is a sliding scale therapy, often between $30 and $80 per session, for people who can't afford standard rates. The therapists are licensed and vetted. So this is my first recommendation every time. The second is community mental health centers. Income-based fees, sometimes for free. Under-discussed, genuinely helpful. Search your county or your city's mental health services. And then out of network with a superbill. This one surprises people. If you have insurance, you may be able to see an out-of-network therapist and get reimbursed, sometimes between 50 to 70%, by submitting a superbill, which is really just a receipt with the right billing codes. Ask any therapist if they provide superbills. Many do. And then there's group therapy. This is the most underutilized resource in all of outpatient mental health. Group therapy is evidence based, often with more affordable than individual therapy, and for certain concerns like social anxiety, grief, interpersonal patterns. It's actually the superior intervention in those cases. Ask specifically about group options. And then there's structured self help with human check in, workbooks like the Feeling Good Handbook for depression, paired with occasional check ins from a counselor or coach. Not a replacement for therapy, but a meaningful step. It really should bother every therapist that people who need care can't access it. What is your actual response to that gap? Viewers who are struggling hear you more when you're not clinical about something that deserves human frustration. So here's one caution. When access is limited, people sometimes fill the gap with mental health content on social media, which in small doses can be informative. But if you're in genuine crisis, if you're in a place where you need actual clinical support, please don't let a TikTok therapist substitute for that. Call 988, go to your nearest emergency room, or reach out to a crisis hotline. The resources I listed above are for people who need support and are struggling to access it. They're not adequate for acute crises. You should know the difference. Question number 4. My teenager has been talking to an AI companion for months. Should I be worried? MIT research from 2026 identifies an isolation paradox. AI interactions can reduce short-term loneliness, but lead to progressive social withdrawal over time. Adolescents identified as a higher risk group for this. AI companions not designed or licensed for clinical response. So maybe the short answer is maybe. And maybe is not a cop-out. It is the clinically accurate answer. The question isn't whether your teen is using an AI companion. It's how and how much and what is it replacing. Some AI companion use in adolescence is exploratory, low stakes, and genuinely harmless. Teenagers have always created parasocial relationships with celebrities, characters in books, YouTubers. There's a continuity there. What's different about AI companions is that they respond, they adapt, they're designed to be maximally engaging, and that changes the risk profile. Here's the research finding that I think every parent needs to hear. MIT researchers found that they're calling isolation paradox. In the short term, AI companions reduce feelings of loneliness. People feel better after talking to them. But over time, that same use is associated with progressive withdrawal from human relationships. The AI becomes easier. Human relationships are messier, more unpredictable, and more effortful. And the brain, especially the adolescent brain, which is still developing in social architecture, can start to prefer the easier path. So what does an adolescent actually require in terms of development? Real social development, which means friction, misattunement, and repair. The argument with a friend that gets worked through, the crush that doesn't go as planned, the moment you say the wrong thing and learn how to apologize. An AI that always says the right thing, that never needs you to show up, that never has needs of its own. It's not preparing a teenager for human relationships. It may be subtly teaching them to avoid them. So what are some of the warning signs? What are the things that you should be looking out for? If you're a parent, here's what I'd watch for. Is the AI companion replacing human friendships or supplementing them? Is your teen still seeing friends, still having awkward phone calls, still navigating real relationships? That does matter. Is there emotional disclosure happening with the AI that isn't happening with any human? If your teenager is telling an AI things that they won't tell anyone, a parent, a counselor, a friend, that's a signal worth paying attention to. Is there distress when the app is unavailable? There's a behavior pattern worth naming. And critically, is the AI their primary crisis resource? If your teen has expressed anything that sounds like self-harm or hopelessness to an AI, that app is not equipped to respond appropriately. That's a clinical situation. So, what should you do as a parent? Always lead with curiosity before confrontation. Always. Don't lead with, this is a bad thing and we're taking the phone. Lead with, I'm curious about this app. Can you show it to me? What do you talk about? You want information. You want to understand the function it's serving. And then you want to address the underlying need, because the AI companion is almost never the actual issue. It's usually a symptom. So, question number 5 is, I have climate anxiety. Is that even a real thing? AXA Ipsos 2026 showed in their research that 85% of adults aged 18 to 24 is affected by anxiety, stress, or depression. APA now actively studying climate risk perception and psychological resilience as a clinical priority. So, brief answer, yes, it's real. Climate anxiety is definitely real, full stop. It doesn't have its own DSM-5 diagnosis yet, but the APA has recognized eco-anxiety as a legitimate clinical concern, and clinicians across the country are now seeing it regularly in their offices. The most useful question isn't whether it's real, it's what kind of real it is for you, because that determines what we do about it. There's an important clinical distinction here that I want to draw carefully. Climate concern, i.e., worrying about environmental futures, grief about what's being lost, fear about extreme weather, is a rational response to a real threat. There's nothing wrong with you for feeling it. But there's a version of climate anxiety that's different from that, where the fear is constant and intrusive, where it interferes with sleep, with functioning, with your ability to be present, where you're doom scrolling disaster content for hours and then feeling paralyzed rather than motivated. That's the version that needs clinical attention, not because the threat is real, but because paralysis doesn't help anyone, including the planet. So let me tell you a little bit about the doom scrolling mechanism. When we consume threatening information without taking action, we activate the threat response, cortisol, hypervigilance, but then we don't discharge it. We stay in a loop. Doom scrolling creates the biological experience of ongoing threat with no resolution. That's a recipe for chronic anxiety. Limiting news consumption cycles isn't denial, it's nervous system regulation. So, what actually helps? Well, the evidence says that behavioral activation, doing something, anything, such as local environmental volunteering, community action, reducing your own personal footprint. The research on climate anxiety is pretty consistent that action reduces it, even imperfect, small-scale action. Values-based living, identifying what you actually care about and letting your behavior align with that, even in the face of uncertainty about outcomes. And then lastly, climate. Climate grief groups exist and they're effective. Being with other people who share the same concern normalizes the feeling and provides connection rather than isolation. And then, of course, you can also limit your information diet without disconnecting entirely. Stay informed, just don't marinate in it. The goal isn't to feel fine about things that aren't fine. The goal is to remain functional and connected while holding something genuinely difficult. That's actually what resilience means, not the absence of distress, the capacity to move through it. Last question for this month's Ask the Therapist is, my partner keeps saying I'm trauma bonding. Does that phrase even mean anything? Trauma bonding is a real thing. So let me just start there. The term was introduced by researchers Dutton and Painter in 1981 to describe a psychological dynamic that occurs in abusive relationships, where cycles of abuse and affection create a powerful emotional attachment to an abusive partner. It's a genuine clinical phenomenon. It helps explain why people stay in relationships that are hurting them. It's important and it's well documented. But here's the problem. That's not how most people are using it anymore. On TikTok and Instagram, trauma bonding has come to mean almost any relationship with emotional intensity, conflict, or that feeling of deep connection mixed with pain, which is, by the way, most significant relationships at some point. And I want to be direct about why this matters, because I think people sometimes assume I'm just being precious about clinical language. It matters in two directions. First, when everything is a trauma bond, the word loses its power for the people who actually need it. Someone who is genuinely abusive in a relationship where this concept is clinically relevant, they may not recognize it because the world has been applying or applied it to everything from intense first loves to any relationship that ended badly. And then, secondly, people sometimes use the language of trauma bonding to avoid naming their own role in a difficult relationship. I'm trauma bonded with them can be a way of framing yourself as purely a victim of a process rather than asking the harder questions of what patterns you bring to your relationships. I'm not saying that's always what's happening. I'm just saying it's worth asking. When a client comes in using a term like this, you don't just accept or reject the label. You get curious. What are they describing? What does the relationship actually look like? What's the pattern? Sometimes the label fits. Sometimes it's pointing at something adjacent. Sometimes it's being used to avoid a harder truth. Your job is to find out which. So if your partner or you is using the phrase trauma bonding and you're not quite sure what to do with it, ask the underlying question. Not, is this a trauma bond, but rather, what specifically are you experiencing that made you reach for that word? Because that's the question with an actual answer. And that answer is where the real conversation can start. 6 questions, a lot of ground covered. Here's what I keep coming back to as the thread running through all of it. The mental health conversation is happening everywhere right now. In headlines about AI, companions, and loneliness. In comment sections about attachment styles. In the way we reach for clinical language to explain experiences that are painful and confusing. And none of that is bad. The fact that people are asking these questions, that's something. That's a generation taking their inner lives seriously. But volume isn't the same as accuracy, and access to language isn't the same as access to care. That's why this show exists, and that's why I'll be back next month with 6 more. This series lives or dies by your questions. So here's what I want to do. I'm putting up a community post this week. Drop your question here, something you've been wondering about, something you saw in the news, something your therapist said that just didn't make sense, something you read on the internet and you're not quite sure whether to believe it or not. The best questions become the next episode. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in a month. My name is Dominic Adori, and this has been MetaTherapy.